All right. I'm going to be talking about using moral categories to ground the epistemic. This is a workshop or a conference on recent work in intellectual character, and this is very, very recent. So I hope it fits the theme. All right. So there is a question in the literature on virtue epistemology about the difference between epistemic or intellectual virtues and moral virtues. So this comes up in general theorizing about the epistemic virtues. For example, even Aristotle at the very beginning of his discussion of virtues and epistemic virtues talks about, well, how do they differ from moral virtues? And he gives a bunch of ways in which he thinks the intellectual virtues differ from the moral ones. And up into the 20th and 21st century, this is still a core question amongst those theorizing about epistemic or intellectual virtue. Secondly, this question comes up in specific debates about individual virtues. So, for example, many people have noticed recently that open-mindedness seems to have both epistemic versions and moral versions, and perhaps other versions as well, aesthetic versions, political versions. What divides at least the epistemic versions of open-mindedness from the moral versions of open-mindedness? There are at least two rough kinds of views or categories of views. One view or one answer to the question is epistemic and moral virtues are just independent kinds of virtues. They don't overlap. So, for example, both Julia Driver, and Baer seem to think that they are just structurally different. So, for example, Driver thinks that epistemic virtues are self-regarding, aimed at epistemic goods, whereas moral virtues are other regarding and aimed at moral goods. Baer likewise thinks that that they are different in terms of their structure, and therefore just qualify as different kinds of virtues. Others think they're independent but of a shared genus. So Swanton, following Aristotle, thinks that they're both forms of excellence, different forms of excellence, but nonetheless forms of a broader category, namely traits of excellence. The other common answer, and I don't intend these to be entirely exhaustive, but the other common answer is that epistemic virtues form a proper subset of the moral. That is, all epistemic virtues are moral virtues, but not vice versa. So how could an epistemic virtue be a moral virtue? Well, it might do so by contributing to human flourishing. This is a view that Zagzebski doesn't always, say, definitely, but is at least sympathetic to. That it's moral in the sense that human flourishing is a moral category, a moral issue, and epistemic virtues contribute to human flourishing non-contingently. Likewise, a very different kind of view is that it comes from someone like Clifford, who thinks that epistemic virtues such as respect for evidence are also moral because they bear some intimate connection to the production of moral actions. And the vices, likewise, bear some fairly stable or predictable relation to the production of immoral actions. So both very different, but they share in common the idea that epistemic virtues are one kind of moral virtue. So I'm going to sketch a very different kind of view today. I'll put it somewhat ambitiously, because when you put a view ambitiously, that's when you see its biggest flaws or shortcomings, as well as potentially its biggest assets. So I know that the view is going to struggle with things, but this is a workshop, and so I'm going to work on it. So what is the view? I'm going to defend a subset view according to which epistemic virtues are a proper subset of moral virtues. In what sense? In the sense that all epistemic virtues, or at least most of them, qualify as both properly epistemic and properly moral. But I'm not going to be talking about moral in the broad sense that Zagzebski and others use the term. For example, I'm not going to use moral to mean human flourishing. Rather, I'm going to talk about moral in the narrower, more modern sense, what Bernard Williams calls the peculiar institution, that having to do with duties and obligations, properly moral duties and obligations, as opposed to the good more generally or excellence more generally. But I'm not going to talk about epistemic virtues merely as an aid to moral action. That is, they're not moral only in the instrumental sense that they promote some other moral thing, namely moral action. Rather, I'm going to try and show that epistemic virtues are properly moral in some more intrinsic sense. So as you might have guessed, this view that I'll outline is going to be Kantian in spirit. Kantian what spirit? In the sense that it's centered primarily on the idea that rational natures are objective ends, ends in themselves. It's not going to be Kantian in every way, thank goodness. One way it's not going to be Kantian is the idea, according to Kant, that virtue, moral virtue, is just strength of will in the face of internal obstacles, such as temptation to do the wrong thing. So for him, moral virtue is just basically an instrumental good, being able to resist the temptations not to do your duty. I'm not going to cash out epistemic or moral virtue in terms of strength of will. So it won't be Kantian in that way. So the plan for the rest of this lecture is the following. I'm going to sketch the basics of the view, the outline, in the form of 4 theses. After that, I'll explain why the view qualifies as a view about epistemic virtue as opposed to merely moral virtue. I'll point to some potential avenues or reasons to support it or believe it, and I'll outline one upshot or interesting consequence of the view. All right, so the first thesis is the basic Kantian one, that there's an important moral truth expressed in the principle of humanity. That is, one ought to treat others always as ends in themselves and never as mere means. I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with this formulation of the categorical imperative. So even if we disagree with Kant about other versions of the imperative and what exactly it means to treat someone as an end in themselves, I think many people agree that there's some important truth expressed by the principle of humanity. So what is an objective end? Roughly, I think an objective end as a rational nature, or having the capacity for autonomy, not simply being driven by your strongest desire, for example, but having the capacity to step back and evaluate your desires, perhaps resist your desires. How does the fact that something is a rational nature, has the capacity for autonomy, how does it generate oughts? Obligations, duties? Well, it can do so in one of 2 ways, or both ways. First, it could do it perfectly in the sense that the fact that you are an end in yourself restricts me at every moment from treating you certain ways. So I cannot, for example, manipulate you. That's a perfect duty. This can also generate imperfect duties in the sense that I have an obligation, a duty to promote you, cultivate your talents, make it so you can develop your autonomy in a more actualized way as opposed to just having a mere capacity. I don't have to do this all the time in every sense, but enough of the time and enough of the senses, etc. So the second thesis is that an important aspect of autonomy generally is intellectual autonomy. So autonomy generally is the ability to respond to reasons and act on those reasons. Not just be driven by your strongest desire, but to step back and decide whether or not this desire, whether that gives you a reason, and to organize your life around how much of a reason you think it gives you, so on and so forth. Intellectual autonomy is basically the same idea in the intellectual sphere. So it's roughly the capacity to be responsive to reasons for belief, to pursue lines of inquiry that one finds productive or worth pursuing, to gather and examine evidence, to question methodologies, to examine inferences, to offer justifications, so on and so forth. So why think that intellectual autonomy deserves the same respect or the same moral status as autonomy more generally? Well, I think Kant's reasons, or the basic reasons to respect rational natures, apply also to respecting the intellectual part of rational natures. That is, just as one can't help but act in a way that respects or sees as authoritative one's practical reason, one can't help but think except by respecting or giving some authority to one's intellectual autonomy. Third thesis, at least some kinds of mental states fall under the scope of the principle of humanity. They might do so indirectly or instrumentally. For example, if I have a tendency to not attend, or attention is a mental state, to other people's needs, I'm going to be more likely to act in such a way that I ignore those needs. I won't be acting on my imperfect duty, for example, to promote their needs. But I'm interested more in the direct way in which mental states might fall under the scope of the principle of humanity. That is, Basu and others think, for example, that a belief itself can, in some circumstances, wrong another person. So, for example, if the racist believes of a Black person that they're inherently less capable, the idea is not only that they've harmed them in the sense that if they said that, that would be offensive, or if they acted on that, they're more likely to bring about serious harm to the person or some sort of injustice, but that merely thinking that, merely believing that, is itself a form of wronging. So we can quibble with the details about how this works, but the basic idea is some of the time, at least some kinds of mental states are a form of disrespect or respect. In what way? By respecting a person's autonomy generally, or in fact, by respecting their intellectual autonomy. So for instance, I might disrespect in a belief your general autonomy by saying you don't have a capacity to form a conception of the good and act on it. But I might disrespect your intellectual autonomy if I believe of you that you don't have the capacity to respond to evidence or to adjust your credences or to question authorities that you grew up with, things like this. Because at least some epistemic virtues and vices involve the manifestation of mental states of the sort that fall under the principle of humanity. At least some epistemic virtues and vices themselves fall under the principle. So here's an example. Objectivity or fair-mindedness plausibly manifests respect, whether for myself or for other people, by refusing to make an exception for myself or other people. So for example, if I am unfair in my adjudication of evidence, it may be that I am privileging that evidence that supports my view over that supports your view. This is a case where I put myself above you, despite the evidence being, say, equal or in favor of you, in which case I'm disrespecting your status as an equal. Likewise with vice. Intellectual dishonesty, whether I'm intellectually dishonest with you or intellectually dishonest with myself, is a form of deception. That's why I guess the name dishonesty. So for example, if I send you, my student, a bunch of sources that support one view and no sources that support another, I'm being intellectually dishonest with you. I'm deceiving you by giving you the sense that the issue is decided, that there's only one side out there in the scientific community, for instance. If I deceive myself, for example, by refusing to check to see whether those claims that confirm my view are well supported, I am deceiving myself by not giving myself, intentionally in some form, not giving myself full information. So the view in rough outline is that epistemic virtues, or at least many of them, maybe not all, but at least many of them, are at the very least dispositions to manifest respect, whether indirectly in the less interesting way or directly. Via intellectual activities, the beliefs we form about others, for example, the thoughts that cross our minds, the lines of inquiry we pursue, our responses to counter-objections or counter-arguments to objections, etc. And specifically, it's respect or disrespect for others' intellectual autonomy or for our own intellectual autonomy. So for example, the epistemic virtue of open-mindedness here would be a disposition to manifest respect via my intellectual activities for your capacity as an intellectually autonomous being. It's as if I come across you and say, all right, this one is a person who has the capacity to think for themselves, and I am going to become open-minded as a response to that. That would be the way this view works in the case of open-mindedness. All right, so before we look at why one might believe such a view, let's just focus on the question, why would this qualify as an account of epistemic virtues? Because someone might have the following sort of worry. Look, I understand that there's epistemic virtue involved here, talking about open-mindedness, talking about objectivity, fair-mindedness, etc. But what you're pointing out is that epistemic virtues correspond to a moral virtue. That is, for example, epistemic objectivity has as a partner moral objectivity, or epistemic open-mindedness has as a partner moral open-mindedness. Or perhaps what you're showing is that there's a moral reason to be epistemically open-minded, or a moral reason to be epistemically objective. None of this, if these characterizations are true, it would show that this is not a view of epistemic virtue as moral virtue, but a view of epistemic virtue having, moral counterparts or something like that. So I need to show or explain why this account of virtue is an account of epistemic virtue in particular. I think there are three reasons, sort of guilt by association reasons, or not guilt, but partners in, what is that phrase? Partners in guilt kinds of reasons. That is, I'll show that the kinds of reasons given in the literature for why something is epistemic, properly epistemic, apply also in this case. So consider first how many people, at least as an initial way of dividing the epistemic from the non-epistemic, the epistemic from the moral, for instance, just point to the fact that the virtue or the activity is intellectual. So for example, Swanton says, look, we have all these forms of excellence. We've got aesthetic excellence, we've got sporting excellence, we've got moral excellence, we've got epistemic excellence. What makes this epistemic excellence as opposed to, say, sporting or moral excellence? Well, it's because it involves epistemic activities like, evidence engagement, belief formation, etc. So if the fact that a virtue involves traditionally epistemic or intellectual activities is sufficient to make it epistemic, then this counts as epistemic. Now, again, I'm not sure that it does, but if others are allowed to do this, then I am allowed to do this as well. Secondly, the object of the activities is something epistemic. That is, on my view, to have an epistemic virtue is at the very least to respond in the appropriate way to an epistemic thing in the world, namely the intellectual autonomy of other people or yourself. So does this fact that the object of the virtue is an epistemic thing make the virtue itself epistemic? Well, this kind of move is used by other people. For example, Miranda Fricker, in her famous work on testimonial injustice, calls it epistemic injustice rather than just moral injustice, precisely because it involves injustice towards a person's epistemic capacities, a speaker's epistemic capacities. So if the object of the injustice is epistemic, that makes, in this case, the injustice itself epistemic. Well, the same thing applies here. If the object of the virtue is an epistemic thing, that would seem to make the virtue itself epistemic in the same way. So far, the activity is epistemic, the object is epistemic. Those are two reasons, two defeasible reasons at least, to think that the virtue, the disposition is itself also epistemic. Third, many of the virtues act as what are called threshold adjusters. So I borrow this from Grimm's distinction between epistemic things that are goal-oriented, such as evidence, and epistemic things that are threshold relevant, such as stakes. So for example, if the stakes are high, the idea goes, then the bar for justification goes up. So for example, if my belief determines whether or not someone lives or dies, the standard, the minimum amount of evidence to qualify that belief as justified is going to be much higher than if the stakes were whether or not I win a board game. But here, the stakes move the threshold, and so qualify as epistemic, even though they don't have to do with, for example, truth promotion. So in general, a lot of people see these encroachment phenomena, whether pragmatic encroachment or moral encroachment, as epistemic in virtue of being threshold adjusters. So this is why, for example, Basu and Schroeder think that it is impossible for someone to be epistemically faultless and morally blameworthy, because when the moral stakes are high, it raises the epistemic bar. So for example, when your friend comes home who's an alcoholic, or your partner comes home who's an alcoholic, and they look a little drunk, and you think to yourself, did they fall off the wagon? The idea is here, you may have a lot of evidence that they did, and so you're epistemically faultless, but you're being a poor partner, a poor friend by automatically thinking that. But the explanation out of this for Basu and Schrader is that no, the moral stakes there raise the bar for justification, so you're not epistemically faultless. Though you have some evidence that they're drunk, it's not enough evidence given that the bar is higher than it usually is. So many of the virtues, as I say, act as threshold adjusters. Think of the example of charity, intellectual charity towards others. What is charity? I think it works roughly as this. Someone says something, gives you an argument, makes a claim, whatever it may be, and there are many different ways to interpret it. Many ways to interpret it that are compatible with the evidence they've given you. Some are very uncharitable. They've said this stupid thing or this thing that lacks any support whatsoever. Some are more charitable. They've given a plausible idea. It's a view that's a contender, one that may be right, that may be borne out by the evidence. So charity, I think, is the idea that we should raise the bar in that case for what counts as a justified interpretation, given the range of interpretations that are consistent with the evidence. Whereas if there were no adjustment, you could perhaps just go to the lowest one. So if this is what's happening with many virtues, as perhaps it is things like open-mindedness, charity, then the virtues in question count as epistemic in the same way that pragmatic or moral encroachment phenomena count as epistemic for exactly the same reason. All right, so why believe such a view? Let me outline three potential reasons why it might, three potential sources from which it might receive support. So the view predicts that many, perhaps most, or perhaps not all, perhaps just a lot of epistemic virtues will involve a manifestation of respect, and that many epistemic vices will involve a corresponding manifestation of disrespect. And it doesn't just predict this, but it also explains why the epistemic virtues will involve many epistemic virtues will involve a manifestation of respect, and many epistemic vices will involve a manifestation of disrespect. So it's not just a coincidence. It's not just a contingent feature of the history of our moral concepts and the history of our epistemic concepts that some of them kind of align, that there's epistemic open-mindedness and, by the way, also moral open-mindedness. No, it says we should expect that a lot of them overlap because the epistemic in many cases involves at least a minimal moral element. So here are some examples that plausibly can be interpreted in terms of respect, whether for one's own intellectual autonomy or for another's intellectual autonomy. When I am intellectually humble, or at least some forms of intellectual humility, one thing I am recognizing is that other people have the ability to come to know the world, and that maybe in this situation, they've come to know the world better than I have. So in the face of disagreement, for example, often that produces some humility. And humility here is respect for other people's capacities, their capacities to come to understand and know the world perhaps as well or better than I have. Even if at the end of the day, I think they're mistaken, that humility is a respect for their capacity. Likewise with open-mindedness, as I've already mentioned. To be open-minded is to recognize, or involves at least the recognition that other people perhaps may have something to offer you epistemically. even if at the end of the day, in that situation, they don't, that it turns out their argument against your view is not plausible, or whatever it may be. To be open-minded is to recognize their capacity to offer that. I'm not open-minded to rocks precisely because I don't think rocks have anything to offer me. Objectivity, likewise, the idea of not privileging one's own view on the basis of a certain amount of evidence more than others' views on the basis of the same amount of evidence, that is a form of respect. Or think of independence. Intellectual independence is a recognition, or seems to require a recognition, that I am capable, at least some of the time, at least some of the degree, of figuring out the world without others' help, or without relying completely on others. That I have the ability, for example, to question the views that every single person around me is giving me, because I have the ability to evaluate sources of knowledge. I don't just have to take them at face value. I can question them. Or carefulness in the light of other people's claims, or in the presence of other people. To be careful, just as in the moral case, carefulness, and like the traditional moral case, carefulness can manifest respect. Likewise, in the epistemic case, to be careful with your claims is to recognize, for example, that you can deceive others, or that you can be dismissive of others by not being careful. We've already talked about honesty. Let's turn to some of the vices. So just as independence involves a recognition of your own autonomy, likewise, dependence involves a lack of recognition of your own autonomy. That is, you can't figure things out for yourself, at least not even to an extent, not even some of the time, that you need to depend on others for any sort of epistemic achievement. And I'm not denying, of course, that we need to depend on others. Clearly we do. But if one is entirely dependent on others, unwilling to try and think things through on their own, or to fact check on their own, or to do a simple calculation on their own, is to underestimate what they're capable of. So oftentimes I get emails from students to the effect of, it's almost the end of the term, is it still possible for me to get a B, or is it still possible for me to get an A? I really hate these kind of emails, because you have the same information than I do. You just need to punch it into a calculator. So this kind of dependence, it might just be a form of laziness, but this kind of dependence, this idea that they couldn't do this themselves, is a form of disrespect, I think, to what they're capable of. Likewise, closed-mindedness, insofar as open-mindedness is a form of respect, closed-mindedness can be a form of disrespect. Pride, opposite humility. Laziness, I think, is a form of disrespect to yourself, insofar as it is a dismissal of your own capacity to do better epistemically. Disinterest, people who have no interest in any sort of epistemic ends, ignore that important feature of themselves, their capacity to potentially come to know the world. And just as honesty is a form of respect, dishonesty, because it's deception or manipulation, is a form of disrespect. So two important distinctions might help here to generalize this account, that is, to make more and more epistemic virtues properly moral as well. Remember that respect and disrespect can be not just to others, but to yourself. So for example, when I am epistemically dependent, it's not that plausible that I'm disrespecting others. I might be a burden by always asking them for things, but that's not necessarily disrespect. But it seems to be a plausible case where I'm disrespecting myself by glossing over what I'm capable of as someone with at least a bare capacity for intellectual autonomy. Likewise, just as a duty can be both perfect or imperfect, that is something I always have to abide by, or something I have to abide by enough of the time, enough of the ways. An epistemic virtue can be perfect or imperfect in this way. So consider intellectual honesty. This, I think, most plausibly qualifies as a perfect duty in the sense that there's not a lot of circumstances where it's epistemically okay to be dishonest. People generally think that like anytime, or at least my intuition is that anytime you're intellectually dishonest, that's an epistemic flaw. And this would explain that, because dishonesty is always a form of disrespect to others. Now, maybe it's a form of disrespect that's all things considered right in the moment, but at least insofar as disrespect, insofar as it's deception, it's a form of disrespect. And so it seems to qualify as a perfect duty. Whereas we might not have a duty, I think we don't have a duty to be open-minded to every person, every circumstance. We could never continue with inquiry if we have to always stop and be like, all right, let's re-examine whether the earth is flat or round. So I don't think we have to be open-minded all the time, the way we should be intellectually honest all the time. But that wouldn't mean that open-mindedness can't be understood as a form of respect, or at least partly a form of respect. It would just mean it may be imperfect. So perhaps I have a duty to be open-minded in the sense that at least some of the time I have to give some people open-mindedness, because you need to have people to bounce ideas off, including people who disagree with you, to bounce ideas off of in order to build up your own intellectual autonomy. So by being open-minded to others, at least some of the time, I'm cultivating or helping to cultivate in them their own intellectual autonomy, because people need this sort of, back and forth, this challenge, this exposure to different views, unfamiliar views, in order to themselves become intellectually autonomous. Let me take a quick water break. All right. Second potential reason to believe, or at least think such a view is potentially promising. I at least think that many other regarding epistemic virtues and vices, those that involve responses to other people rather than simply to oneself or in isolation, that they lose some of their intuitive force when the situation doesn't involve a person. So consider two different cases of charity. One in which someone gives you an argument, or it's just an argument or a reason, justification, whatever it may be, and it's potentially ambiguous. That is, it can mean different things. That seems to be a case where charity applies, that I have reason to interpret them better, at least not in the worst way, one of the better ways. Perhaps not the best way consistent with the evidence, but at least not the worst way. But when an artificial intelligence gives me an argument, I don't feel any need to be charitable whatsoever. Or if I should interpret the best possible way, it's no longer a form of charity. Rather, it's a form of, open-mindedness, or a form of intellectual honesty for myself. So maybe I feel a need to interpret it in the best light possible, because the best interpretation is going to be the one that's most relevant to whatever it is I'm inquiring about. But the charity seems to not be relevant there, in which case that would count as evidence that charity is intellectual charity is at least partly moral, because the morality here is the response to persons and their capacity for autonomy. And when there's no person there, there's no relevant response. And so charity seems to fall out for that reason. The third potential reason is the following. My view predicts that it's going to be hard to find a person who is epistemically virtuous and yet at the same time morally vicious, at least in the same way at the same time. And I think that this explains why purported examples of epistemic virtue combined with moral vice don't always stand up to that much scrutiny. So for example, I see people mention the fact that you can be very smart and yet morally vicious. In the opening of the groundwork, Kant says the only thing that's good in itself is the goodwill, because talents and all these other things and temperaments, they can be used for bad ends. And he's right, of course. Intelligence can be used for a bad end. But intelligence is not necessarily the same thing as intellectual or epistemic virtue. Perhaps more like a skill than a virtue, in which case it's not a counterexample. Likewise, sometimes you see combinations of moral virtue with stupidity. So Julia Driver gives the example of Forrest Gump, the fictional character from the movie. He seems morally virtuous, he's compassionate, he's honest, blah, blah, blah. But he's gullible. But I'm not sure that his gullibility is anything above and beyond the fact that, he's not that bright. In which case, this would just show that moral virtue is compatible with a lack of intellectual skill, not that it's compatible with epistemic virtue. Third kind of examples that fail fairly easily. It's not enough to show that a person can be both epistemically virtuous and morally vicious, because you can show that a person can be both honest and unkind. That doesn't show that moral virtue is incompatible with moral virtue. It would just show that nobody is perfect, or that it's possible not to be perfect. So it's not enough to show that person, they're hardworking, intellectually honest, but they also cheat on their partner. That's compatible with the epistemic virtue there being a form of moral virtue, just that they're a mixed case of moral virtue and moral vice. So to provide a counterexample, I think we need one of two sorts. That is, the following two sorts of counterexamples would succeed in showing that epistemic virtue is not a form of moral virtue. The first type, the A type, so a person is intellectually virtuous at time one, in virtue of X, Y, or Z, but our moral evaluation of them at that time does not even budge. Because the idea is, if intellectual virtue were a form of moral virtue, the fact that they're intellectually virtuous in that way at that time should at least a little bit bump up our evaluation of them. So Bayer's case from 2011, he says, let's consider the hypothetical case of Smith, whom at T1 we learn is cold-hearted toward his wife, severely neglectful of his children, and consistently unfriendly to his neighbors. Accordingly, we make the judgment that Smith is a morally deficient or unvirtuous person. Check. Suppose then we learn of Smith that he's also an accomplished biologist with a genuine thirst for knowledge and understanding of the natural world, and that this desire leads him to engage in scientific inquiry that's systematically careful, thorough, fair-minded, rigorous, tenacious. I can see little problem with inferring that Smith might, on this account, be genuinely intellectually virtuous. Nonetheless, I fail to see we are in a position to revise our moral estimation of him. So the idea is, we got a crappy estimation given Smith's treatment of his family. We add some intellectual virtue, but the moral estimation hasn't changed. If this is right, this would serve as a counterexample. But when we notice that he's careful, he's a scientist, which means that he needs to be careful with other people's work, not just with his own evidence, with his own data, but with other people's work, thorough with his other people's work, fair-minded with other people's work. Once you add this, my evaluation improves. If I find that someone gave him some evidence that potentially undermined his theory, and he didn't just dismiss them, but was fair-minded and thorough and careful with his examination of them, my response is, yeah, he's a piece of shit, but at least he's not all the time. Here's a case where he's a good person or shows some moral promise in his engagement with other people. So let's consider a second type of counterexample. A person who's intellectually virtuous in ways X, Y, or Z at time one, but at the same time is morally vicious because of those exact same X, Y, and Z. So Basu's case of Sherlock Holmes might work. So the idea is he's epistemically virtuous, perhaps because he's dogged in his pursuit of evidence and explanation, but he's also just kind of a jerk. He sees people as objects to be studied. He's too frank. He's cold. He's doesn't make small talk, et cetera, et cetera. If that's right, that would potentially qualify as a B-type counterexample, but I'm not sure if this is the best description of Sherlock Holmes. First of all, he's never really described as epistemically virtuous, using like virtue terms like open-minded or humble, but rather he describes more as like a paragon of rationality. And obviously, rationality and virtue are going to overlap much of the time, but it might be that he's just entirely rational without being virtuous. But more importantly, even if he is epistemically virtuous, it's not clear that his jerkhood comes from that epistemic virtue. It just looks like he's a jerk for epistemically independent reasons, which is fine. This just shows that you could be potentially morally virtuous in one way and not in another. That this is perfectly compatible with Sherlock Holmes being a little bit morally virtuous because of his epistemic virtue, but also morally vicious in other ways. So in order to qualify as a B-type example, it would need to be that just in virtue of his epistemic virtue, at least in this case, he is morally vicious. But this is not such a case, and so it's not a counterexample. I got time for an upshot?
Yes.
All right. So why this view? It's a radically different view of moral virtue, and I think it's always good to throw in radically different views into a debate, especially as a debate becomes more solidified with established positions, with the idea that maybe there was a mistake early on or a missed opportunity, and it's hard to recover that as the debate becomes more solidified. So I just think in general, it's good to throw in weird views, different views from time to time to debates to force re-examinations. But one upshot of this view is it seems to provide a very different kind of conception of epistemic virtue. So most people, from my knowledge, and again, I'm not that much of an expert in the literature, but from what I know, most people seem to think that something qualifies as an epistemic virtue only if, this is not sufficient, but only if it stands in some appropriate relation to fundamental epistemic goods. Most of these goods seem to be truth dependent. That is, they require truth in some way, or they make some essential reference to truth, even if the good necessarily isn't just reducible to truth. So for example, many people talk about a constraint on epistemic virtue, a necessary condition on epistemic virtue, being that it promotes or is conducive to truth, or you can put it in terms of knowledge, or in terms of understanding. So Zagzebski famously says in her Virtues of the Mind that part of what it means to be epistemically excellent is that the epistemic excellence is reliable in achieving its end, namely truth. But even if we drop this conduciveness condition, require only something like the appropriate motivation towards truth, or towards understanding, or towards knowledge, we still have some connection to truth. So even if it's just a love of truth rather than actual reliability in acquiring truth, that's still a truth-dependent good. Or Bayer, for instance, talks about virtuous open-mindedness, and one requirement he gives is that you have to have a reasonable belief that the open-mindedness is appropriately related to truth, and as far as it conduces to it, it promotes it. So again, it may not be true that it does promote it, but there has to be at least a reasonable belief that it does. So all of these ways of connecting epistemic virtue to some fundamental epistemic good do so in virtue of connecting in some way to some good that has a truth component. So one way in which my view is very different is that it ties epistemic virtue, at least in part, towards an epistemic good that is not truth dependent, that is instead truth independent. Not simply an epistemic good that runs past truth and is not reducible to truth, but an epistemic good that is entirely orthogonal to truth, that of intellectual autonomy. So why is intellectual autonomy truth independent? Well, I think we can see this for two reasons. I can respect a person's intellectual autonomy. That is, I can see the fact that they're autonomous as a reason to respond to them differently than I would if they were not autonomous. Even if I think that their autonomy is not going to end in truth or knowledge or understanding. Even if I think, for example, they're going to crash and burn as an epistemic agent, I can still respect their autonomy, just as I can respect someone's practical autonomy without thinking that they're going to therefore make the right decision. Oftentimes, we prefer anti-paternalism, non-interference, as a way of respecting a person's autonomy, without thereby thinking they're going to use that autonomy well. Oftentimes, we know going in they're going to misuse it, or likely going to misuse it, but we still see enough reason to respect their autonomy. The same is true here, but with truth. And so you can respect a person's intellectual autonomy without thinking that they're even likely to gain truth in the context in question. Secondly, respecting a person's intellectual autonomy is also compatible with having no love of truth. That is, just as I can respect a person without loving them, I can respect a person's intellectual autonomy without any connect for love of truth. Rather, all I have is respect. Respect for the moral law, which includes respect for a person's autonomy, which includes respect for their intellectual autonomy. So this is, of course, consistent with virtue, epistemic virtue involving appropriate relations to some other truth-dependent goods, whether truth itself or knowledge or understanding, love of truth, love of knowledge, love of understanding, whatever it may be. But the point is that epistemic virtue on this account bears some relation to an epistemic good, which is truth independent, and which is enough of a reason to develop the epistemic virtue in the first place. So even if there are other connections to truth, knowledge, understanding, whatever, the fact that someone is deserving of respect is itself sufficient reason to respect them. In this case, it's sufficient reason to respect them in my epistemic activities, that is, to develop certain epistemic virtues to manifest respect and avoid manifesting disrespect. I'm about out of time, so I'll end. Thank you, and thanks to Vitor Somavila and Jack Kwong for at least making this better in some respects. Thank you.